Victorian Bayswater, Chapter 3, Kensington Gardens. There are many accounts about the living conditions and make-up of Victorian Britain. All are very interesting, but far too general. We are more concerned about North London, north of the River Thames. To pinpoint the area more precisely, northwest London, around Bayswater and Paddington, in the period that introduces the Kearys to this place just after the Great Exhibition. It was on the outskirts of the city, where there were green fields not so far away, just up the street, with farms, hedges, woods, trees, and all the delights of the country. Still, we mustn't get ahead of ourselves. The picture filled out in more detail, for Bayswater, or Bayswatering, as spelt on Roquet's 1748 map, lies due south of Christchurch. St. James's Church, built and made parochial in 1845, and it was new, being partially rebuilt with the exception of the tower and spire. The Pest House, indicated so prominently on the map, was almost on the site of Craven Terrace Chapel. Lord Craven gave the site at Soho to be used as a burial ground, and knowing the problems faced by the citizens during the plague of 1665, land for a cottage hospital too. The streets of Paddington were not conveniently built, having to walk the whole length for the lack of a side street before moving to a parallel terrace. Further northwards, on the west side of Petersburgh Place, is the Church of St. Matthew, built with a very high spire, consecrated on May the 20th, 1882, and the church had seating for 1,550, of which 355 were available free. The borough boundary turns out of Kensington Gardens into Palace Gardens, crossing the Bayswater Road. It travels northwards between Ossington Street and Clanniclade Gardens, north of Moscow Road. A Greek church stands impressively by, given the name of St. Sophia. Was built of red brick with a high central dome. It reminds one of a storybook picture of a Russian church, and close by a small Baptist chapel, neat and compact, fitted in to be built at the back of Porchester Gardens. And moving across Queen's Road, there stands St. Matthew's Parochial Church, built in 1831 and found not large enough. Was then enlarged, losing most of its playground, in 1861. Further northwards, in Queen's Road, are the large buildings housing Paddington public baths and wash-houses. Alfred Carey courted and married Martha Sutton, named after her mother, who was born on the 11th of July, 1857. Both of her grandfathers were vicars in London. In the first 19 years of married life, they had 10 children. They started out their married life in a small terraced house, number 5, Salem Gardens, Bayswater, which is just off the Moscow Road and Queen's Road, opposite Olympia. Martha's father, William Sutton, was a trained carpenter, and his father, also named William, died in 1870 in office as a vicar in London. William had his carpenter's shop at the bottom of the garden, making doors and windows. They had 2 sons and 7 daughters. One of the sons was also named William, who joined the Royal Marines at Deal and took part in the Egyptian War in 1883. He was wounded and invalided out of the service, dying less than 10 years after returning home. The remaining son and 5 of the daughters married at an early age, leaving daughters Emma and Totty at home to help their mother. Martha had been a trained schoolteacher, and even though she wasn't paid a great deal, in Victorian society it was frowned on for women teachers to be married, so she had to give up her job. Wishing to provide for an increasing family, she started to run a successful hand laundry from home in a large wash-house in the garden. It required enough space on the range to boil the coppers of washing and sufficient room to do the ironing next to the drying room. She employed other women to do the large amount of washing and ironing that was taken in. For laundry work was labour extensive, and for anyone wishing to use these facilities, a major part of the family's budget. It was known fact that infections from mixed washing were possible, so in sensible laundries the washing was separated and hung to dry and suitably aired. W. H. Lever began to sell soap in £1 bars, already wrapped. In 1885, every large house in those days sent out for its laundry to be done. Bayswater was the fashionable part of London, forming the north-west corner of Kensington Park, so there was already business to satisfy close at hand. The washing was sorted out on Saturdays and Sundays and entered into the washing book. This was checked at the end of the process by my great-grandmother. Sheets and linens were covered with lukewarm water and a little soda and left overnight. On Monday the fires to the boiler were lit 2 hours before the rest of the household came down to breakfast, and as soon as the water was hot enough, the sheets and linens were taken out of the overnight soaking water and rinsed in hot water, ladled out of the copper, rubbed and beaten with a dolly or possing stick. The sheets were then wrung out and the water reused to be used for soaking water. It was a long process from soaking, 3 washes, 1 boiling, and a number of rinses. Within all of this were special stain-removing processes and fabric conditioners, and some items unpicked and resewn after processing. Once the first washing had been completed, it was hung out to dry, or if wet, hung under covered ways, and this could take several days. The starching process was complicated in that all the materials needed a particular treatment. An unconditioned linen or cotton quickly became creased and rumpled. The ironing was done on tables. Flat irons were used in pairs. Whilst one was in use, the other was reheating. A dozen irons were arranged on trivets over an open fire, and each iron before use was cleaned on a rubbing cloth. Any adhering starch cleaned off. Irons which were still dirty were rubbed on an emery board. Box irons and goffering irons all had their special uses. Items for repair were set aside and all aired before wrapping, made ready for collection. There is no doubt that Martha had to be extremely organized to run both the house, the large family, and the family business. The fact that she had been a teacher indicates that her own education had been above average, and coming from a middle-class home gave her the spur to maintain her position for both herself and her children. The family owe much to this hard-working woman. Martha's grandfather, Samuel Elas Pierce, was a vicar of one of London's city churches and chaplain to the Lord Mayor of London. The patronage of the Lord Mayor included the appointment of a chaplain who lives and boards in the mansion house, have a suite of rooms, and a servant rides in a state carriage and attends to the Lord Mayor whenever required. He was presented to Queen Victoria at the first levee, and received 50 guineas from the Court of Aldermen and a like sum from the Church of Common Council. His wife, my maternal great-grandmother, often told my father that when she visited her great-grandmother, she would be told many frightening things about events which happened before and after the Great Fire of London in 1666. In Victorian times, the main reception room presented the public face of the family, and it conformed to the accepted strictures of the society. It displayed on shelves, tables, whatnots, a variety of small objects, both expensive and inexpensive, which were reminders of people and places. Tablecloths came right down to the floor with plants in heavy pots and planters. Covers were placed to protect furniture from coal dust and fire embers. Window curtains suspended from poles and rings were tied back to reveal net curtaining, obscuring the view outside. Slip rugs, positioned at the fireside, left exposed the polished wood floor. My grandmother, Martha, named after her mother, Martha Pierce, was the eldest child in the Sutton family. It was usual in those days that the eldest girls in the family took on a great deal of the housework by rota. This would include the cooking and work in the laundry. It was held as convention that this was the way a girl contributed to the home and was properly prepared to pick up her own family. When and if the time came, however, it was clear that there was little affection in the home, especially by her mother. When grandmother showed independence by wearing a new hairstyle, she was told to leave the home and not to return. This seems on the face of it a hard thing to do, but her mother had to control the situation. It was a small house and a large family, and her mother couldn't afford for the situation to get out of hand and lose respect. Fortunately, it all came right in the end. In the late 19th century, most women in England were excluded from political and economic power. Wives and daughters were legally subservient to husbands until the Married Women's Property Acts in 1870 and 1880. Protecting women from beatings by the husband didn't come about until 1891. Martha sought help and comfort from a girlfriend that lived not far away in Caroline Place. She was also a laundress and worked from home. It was not a large house, and there was no room for another person to sleep, so a place was found for her under the ironing table. My grandfather, Alfred Carey, who knew Martha before this event, quickly saw in her a person he could befriend. And shortly after this the Sutton family were reunited, and they were married in 1878. A house found for them for lodging in Sutton Place. The owner of Salem Gardens, who was incidentally the founder of the building firm William Whiteley, demolished the whole site to prepare it for redevelopment. Whiteley was enormously impressed by the great exhibition and all that it offered as an introducer to new fashion and industrial development. He opened a shop in Bayswater, which was then considered, in 1863, a fashionable district of London. And this shop was a success, and he gradually enlarged it, taking on more and more staff, whilst improving his stock. Eventually his stables were one of the largest in London, having 145 vehicles and 320 horses, able to deliver anything the same day. It eventually became one of the new department stores. He called it the Universal Provider, boasting that he could provide anything from pin to elephant. Thomas Lipton called his early shops Irish markets, probably because he sold Irish butter and eggs. There was a great deal of competition between Lipton and the other providers, particularly those who catered for the working class and poor. These lower ends of the market traders didn't worry Whiteley, for he was looking to the middle classes to make his fortune. As a child, Whiteley had gone to school with my great-grandfather, and therefore well known to him. Unfortunately, William, who was married at the time, went out with one of the female staff. This was not an unusual behavioural pattern for him to do, and caused great bitterness. And years later one of the children took revenge on the father for bringing such unhappiness to his mother and family, and shot him. My grandmother was very conscious of her grandfather's position in the church, of Christian principles towards other people who needed help. Her own large family gave her knowledge and understanding about women in labour and child delivery. She became the local unpaid midwife, taking on the responsibility not only being at the birth of neighbouring children, but helping nurse them and their mothers too. Martha did this only to help the family budget, but also to relieve the hardship found at that time in the surrounding streets. Her mother had been trained as a school teacher, which inculcated a desire for learning, and passed on to her children. This prompted her to always take an interest in her children's education. In later life, my father attributed to her his love of learning. The 1870 Elementary Education Act was introduced to ensure all children would be eligible to go to school, and this was the first time a school place was available in a building set aside for the purpose, under a certified head teacher. Previously, most children could only rely upon instruction by the main religious bodies from 1833, and philanthropic organisations such as the Anglican National Society in 1811 and the British and Foreign School Society in 1814. The Victorians found pregnancy something to be hidden and not talked about. Fathers were ignorant as to what was happening, and mothers too were unclear about the physical side of life. Martha's visits and ministrations were much valued. It says much for her fortitude, knowledge and experience, in a time when these were hard to find, that she did all these things without payment. In the middle of the late 1800s, religion was the all-permeating influence not only of the family but the greater society. The parish church was the centre of the social system, the keystone that propped up the government. The main creed was obedience. "Honour thy father and thy mother" was to be heard every Sunday at the church. Church was also a social gathering where everything was discussed, evaluated and equated. The dissenter was an unsocial person to be wary of. The average person was not so concerned about dogma, but of difference. The clergyman was the father of the parish and linked to a great system which had gone on for ages. The landlord was the lawgiver, the representative of the parliamentary system, one of their own, born in the district. He could be seen every day walking about in and out of their houses. He knew them and their troubles, their ideas, their wants, dreams and desires, and after all they were identical to his views as well. It was here that the word and the philosophical understanding of rights had a place. This influenced every living hour of their day. They knew where they stood, and they knew their worth. In the middle to the late 1800s, individuals still didn't regularly bathe. Underclothes were worn as either summer clothes or winter, and not removed except to replace. Strip baths were the only means of washing, either at the outside sink or tin bath. Those elders who were considered fussy used the public baths, which children were encouraged to use, mainly to remove vermin, to stop scratching. This state of affairs lasted until well into the 20th century. And this is how the working class understood the world they lived in, and this is how the middle class saw their place in the grand scheme of things. It was all based upon a rural foundation which was to change, and it wasn't long ago, after all, that most were one time hewers of wood, tillers of soil, and drovers of stock. In the second half of the 19th century, London's rich and middle class moved away from the city centre, which was being swamped by immigrants, particularly Westminster, where the Irish, French and Jews congregated. The rich preferred Sydenham in Kent, and Barnes and Richmond on the Thames. The upper middle class preferred Hampstead and Ealing, north and west of the city, and Penge south. The lower middle class, Camberwell, Hammersmith, Leighton and Balham. Those men who worked in city offices preferred Bayswater, Brixham and Clapham, and all these were at the time the city outskirts. Bayswater lies at the top left-hand corner of Kensington Gardens. Kensington Palace is south, 3/4 of a mile down the road, and Nottingham Hills Gate about the same distance west. It was an ideal place to live.